All right, welcome everyone to our next discussion of literary analysis. And I wanted to spend some time going over how to apply different types of analysis to the same work. And I'm hoping that this will help in terms of just understanding what we're doing and how we can look at the same work from different points of view. So let's go ahead and get started. This is the poem that I wanted to look at. It is by Sara Teasdale, entitled I Am Not Yours. I am not yours, not lost in you, not lost although I long to be, lost as a candle lit at noon, lost as a snowflake in the sea. You love me, and I find you still a spirit beautiful and bright, yet I am I who long to be lost as a light is lost in light. Oh, plunge me deep in love, put out my senses, leave me deaf and blind, swept by the tempest of your love, a taper in a rushing wind. Okay, so that's the poem. And what we're going to do is we're just going to look at this poem from the perspective of several different types of literary criticism or literary analysis. So the first one is formalism. And if you remember, formalism is a type of analysis that looks at just the work itself. And you can pick it apart line by line, stanza by stanza, and just look at the elements within the work to be able to establish meaning. So just some things that I took from this poem, and for each one I've put the poem itself up here on the right so you can continue to reference that. But we can look at formalism in the terms of the literary elements it includes. So for instance, in this poem we can see similes. So as a candle lit at noon, as a snowflake in the sea, and as a light lost in light. And it uses metaphor as well when it describes a taper in a rushing wind. And each of these create an image. So, a candle lit at noon, how effective is that candle going to be? It's already light at noon, so the candle is just going to be lost. And I think that that's an important element in the poem, being lost. Although it says the person is not lost, the narrator is not lost in you, but wants to be. So what would the light from a candle at noon? It would be lost amongst all the other light. And what is light in this poem? So we look at other images and other similes and metaphors connected to light. As a snowflake in the sea. Well, a snowflake on its own is very minuscule, it's small, and if it were to fall in the sea, it would just become a part of the larger whole. So thinking, what is to be lost like a snowflake in the sea? What is what is light in this poem? And then looking at a taper in a rushing wind. And I think that the connection of light in the first two stanzas is then connected to this idea of darkness in the last one. So we see, plunge me deep in love and put out my senses, leave me deaf and blind. So you no longer can see, there's no light there. And if you think of a taper, which is a candle, in a rushing wind, obviously the light will be snuffed out. So looking at the poem itself, what is light and what is it to be lost in this particular poem? So the first two stanzas create this image of light being that overall love. I am not yours, but I long to be yours. So I want to be a small part of this greater whole, whether that's the person that they're talking to, or it could be a small part in the greater love that this person has, because you say, you love me, and I find you still a spirit beautiful and bright. So she's telling the narrator is telling this you in the poem that you are light, you are bright, you are beautiful, and I want to be this small little part. I want to be the light the candle at noon. I want to be the snowflake in the sea. This is very small things going into larger areas. I want to be lost as light is lost in light. But then the last stanza creates this darkness image. Leave me deaf and blind, being swept up in a tempest, in the storm. So there's a longing for something that is not the person that is the audience in this poem. So the audience, the you in the poem, the audience is light and bright and beautiful. And those first two stanzas create this longing for that to be a small part of that greater whole. But then the last stanza creates an opposing image where we see that no, I don't want to be light. I want to be dark. I want to be a storm. I want to be snuffed out. So it's like I want to be all consumed in some other love than what is presented in the first two stanzas. And we can see those just by breaking up the points. So we're coming up with a larger meaning based on these elements within the poem itself. We're not looking outside of the poem. We're not looking at anything other than these images and similes and metaphors and the expression. We can also look at the rhyming pattern. We see the first two stanzas are much more concrete in their rhyming pattern. The first one has an A-B rhyming pattern, so it's very connected. The first and the third line rhyme, the second and the fourth line rhyme, and then the second stanza kind of breaks that, where we have just the second and fourth line rhyme. The first and second first and third don't rhyme like the first stanza. And then the last stanza looks like it rhymes from the way the words are, but they don't actually rhyme. So blind and wind, although have the IND at the end to kind of create the look of a rhyme, they don't actually fit. So you can actually break apart the rhyming pattern to connect it with the meaning of the poem, because we obviously can see this disconnectedness starting to happen as the poem progresses. So formalism is going to try to convey meaning from the poem based on the elements within the poem. And so we can do that same thing within the works that you guys are choosing. So looking at this poem from an archetypal and actually also a psychoanalytical point of view, this is where archetypal is where we look at a work from the archetypes, motifs, and themes that are prevalent throughout all of literature. And I wanted to also throw in there psychoanalytical because Jung, which is that's the Jung, is a psychoanalyst that oftentimes we use when looking at literature. And Jung talks about archetypes and how that creates a psyche for a person, how we as people fit into different archetypes. So you can kind of connect these two ideas together. So we can see a religious symbolism in this poem. And you're like, what? We just talked about love. But actually think about the idea of light. Light is prevalent in so many different types of religions. You see light in even when we look at holidays that are coming up, so we have Hanukkah, which is the holiday of lights, right? It's a celebration of light. We see Christmas with the Star of Bethlehem. We see Kwanzaa, which is also a celebration of light. So using light in their celebrations. So we see light as a religious symbol over and over and over again all over the world with different religions. And so how can religious ideas move into this idea of love? Well, when we look at religion and how there is a desire for people in general to go after light, to look for enlightenment in their lives. And so we can look at that enlightenment idea in light of this poem. So the first stanza obviously is a longing to be part of a greater light. And there's that continuing idea of you love me. So if you look at it in a religious point of view, who is the light in religious points of view? When a Christian and Judaic look at at things, light is God. God is associated as light. So there could be, I am not yours. So I am saying, what is that connection to God there? What is the connection to God in the second stanza when we're talking about, I want to be part of this greater element of light? And then that disconnect, the choice not to follow after God, if we look at it in a religious way, because we're moving away, I want to be blind and deaf. So you can actually look at this from religious symbolism. So it goes beyond the meaning of a personal relationship with one other human being into a relationship with a higher power. So we can look at it with religious symbolism. If we look at the female archetype within this poem, so the author is Sarah Teasdale, so we're going to assume that the narrator is female, and so we have the female archetype of the lover. And obviously this is an interesting perspective because we have a wide range of who a lover is in archetypes. So you could go from the spectrum of being a seductress all the way to being frigid, and this is almost that battle between the two. So am I a seductress? Do I want to follow after love, be plunged deep into love, or am I trying to keep my autonomy, my individuality, without having to connect to that other person? It says, yet I am I. So I am individualized, but I long to have that being lost. So there is that element of lover, and where does the narrator in this poem fall? So you can look on the spectrum between the two, and you can relate that to Jungian critique, or you can look at it just through archetypes in general, which would fit into either one of these literary criticism. And then you could also analyze the paradox of light and dark, which we've already talked about in other slides, but that disconnect or that battle between light and dark, and how is that similar to our archetype of the battle between good and evil? Is that something that's going on in this poem? So these are different ways that you can approach the poem through archetypes or through psychoanalytical criticism. Okay, so the next one is feminism, and I think this is a pretty obvious type of critique that you can use with this poem because we have a female author. We have the idea of love. This is very feminine in idea. So thinking about that, could the expression of expected longing that women should have, is this playing into a non-feminist, a gender role? Are we looking at this poem and this is a typical gender role of a clingy woman that just wants to be loved and is very emotional? Or is this a breakaway from the traditional gender role of being the clingy, I want to be in love, relationship, emotional woman with that line, yet I am I? So creating that individualism. Or could there be a connection between the wish to be an individual and then also that longing to be that expected female identity? So perhaps there is a battle, and that's what the poem is. The meaning of the poem is the battle between being the traditional expected gender role of female and being an individual in which they can decide. The light, that snowflake in the sea, the light that's lost in light, could be that typical gender emotional role, and then to give way into, to plunge into the deep in love, into the darkness. Could that be the element of being their own individual, disconnecting with the expected identity, and thinking about, look at the idea of a taper in a rushing wind that's putting out the light, right? So it's putting out the old ideas of female identity and taking on a new empowered female identity, because the other one, the light was part of a larger light. It was a small part in a larger light, a small snowflake in a large sea. So it's the women's role of being submissive and subjected into this new world of everything is dark. I can't see you, I can't see me. We're just deep and consumed and part of a storm. It's very powerful. So the female idea becomes powerful and equal with the male persona because there's nothing to see. We can't see whether we're male or female. We can't see the traditional roles. We're just deep and connected. So you can see that feminist idea in this particular poem. Okay, then you could also look at the historical criticism. So if we look at Sara Teasdale's life, we can then develop meaning from that historical information. So things to look at. She was born in 1884 in St. Louis, Missouri. Her family was very religious. She actually had a number of suitors before she actually married in 1914. So she was 30 years old, is that right? Yeah, 30 years old before she married. And she had already rejected a number of suitors before that time. She published love songs in 1917, so after she was married, but then divorced in 1921. She had a bout of pneumonia that left her as an invalid, and she committed suicide in 1933. So we have a lot of elements that if we look back at all those things we've already talked about, you can actually see in light of her life, you can develop some meaning from this poem. So for instance, her family is very religious, so she is used to incorporating those religious ideas into her work, and that develops meaning because we see a disconnect between what was in the past or what is being longed for, and then what is the poem developing into this dark, deep love. So how does that connect to her life in terms of her family being very religious? Was she very religious? You can look at that connection there. And then this idea of rejecting suitors before she actually married. So this is something that could be a response to those that she had already rejected. So she had this where she had people that loved her and she felt that love and she felt that connection but didn't quite go there. And then finally she got married. She found that deep love where her senses are left deaf and blind, and so it's all consuming. So she finally said, okay, now I'm ready because this is really what I wanted. And then we don't see actually the decline in her life until after this poem is written. So we might not have to look at in terms of that she committed suicide because it is not quite there yet. But we can also assume perhaps this love that she is in with her husband is starting to wane. Perhaps because obviously this is after she is married and she's finding herself where she's not really as much in love with her husband as she thought she was. And so perhaps that poem is directed toward her current relationship when this poem was published. So these are things to look at in terms of a historical perspective. We can also look at what life was like in St. Louis, what life was like in 1914, 1917 when the poem was written. We look at, World War I and that connection of men going off to war and women being left at home. And so there can be definitely looking at a historical perspective beyond her own life, beyond the biographical element, and look at the way that people related to one another during that particular time period as well. And I also have all that, found a lot of this information from poets.org in terms of her life. And finally, we look at the same poem through reader response. And reader response is where we put meaning on a piece of literature due to our own experiences. So our response creates the meaning. So you can take a look at this poem. For me, I would have to look at it from my perspective. So I could look at this from traditional ideas of breakups, perhaps. Maybe this poem made me think of breakups because there's obviously someone that does not love as much as she wants to. So a traditional role of breakup would be, a devastating, heart-wrenching breakup, but then there's also that relationship where you're just like, I'm not really that into you. That's kind of what this made me think of. I'm just not that into you, and what that connection is and how that developed meaning for me. My association with candles and light may be different than somebody else's, but I might associate it from my own background. My own religious background could give a different perspective on what a candle and light is. And then the last stanza to me creates this sense of being out of control. And is that positive or is it negative? In the light of the poem kind of presents it in what they want to be. So it's a positive idea, but do I really think that being out of control in love is a positive thing? So that would be something I'd have to reflect on in my own life. So reader response is really looking at elements in the works and reflecting on how your own life experience can create a different meaning than maybe what was traditionally expected. So that's what I have for this week, just trying to help you along in terms of how to apply literary criticism to the works that you've chosen. Keep in mind that I have changed the due date, so we have until the end of this week to complete the work, and you will need to apply at least one of these points of view that we've talked about so far in the class. I didn't cover every type of literary criticism here today, but keep these things in mind as you go into analyzing your works. We are creating our drafts this week, so be sure that you are writing away before you turn in that final draft. So if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email or give me a call, shoot me a text to get a hold of me some way, and I'd be happy to help you along. Other than that, have a great week, and thank you so much for listening in. Bye.